story is true. So Jesus was never crucified, it was someone else, right? And whatever happened, happened to this other body, not to Jesus. Why then, if that's true, do people believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and why do they start to venerate a Sunday? From the Islamic perspective, what reason is there for that to happen? Let's ask this Jew.
I'm ignorant.
Tell me, here's a Jew, right? Is there any Jewish reason that you can think of in the Torah or in the prophets for Jews to venerate the Sunday as a special day? None.
Seventh day, the Sabbath, Saturday.
Right.
Friday night, 4th of Saturday.
There you go. No reason. Right? But the first Jewish Christians started to do it. Why? Well, I have an answer. It's called the resurrection. The Quran has no answer for the fact. The fact of the Jewish Christians venerating a Sunday makes no sense if the Quran is true. But the fact is still there. The fact is that the Jewish Christians do venerate the Sunday, and there's no Quranic reason for them to do so.
What is the evidence that they venerated on the Sunday? Is it based on the New
Great question. The evidence is that if you read the book of Acts, which is a first century document written by Christians, talking to Christians about what Christians did, they state that they would gather in one another's homes on the Lord's day and break bread. So it states very clearly, on the first day of the week, the Lord's day, they would gather and celebrate their Christian faith. That's first century evidence. It's not just that though. You also have church tradition. In the Didache or in the writings of the church fathers, Sunday is held up as an important day. So we've got that from 1st and 2nd and 3rd century documentation about the practices of Christians. This is why no historian disputes the fact that Christians venerated Sunday as a holy day. But as you just heard from my Jewish friend, there's no Jewish reason to do that. Which means that something happened to those Jews that convinced them that Sunday was a special day. If the Quran is true, then there is no reason for that to happen, but it did happen.
Does the Quran dispute that particular
Yeah, the
thing?
Quran says Jesus was never crucified.
Okay.
And if he was never crucified, he was never
All those
resurrected.
things didn't happen.
All of those things didn't happen, but they did happen. And since they did happen, you've got a problem for the Quran. Because history is demonstrating that the Quran is talking fiction when it says Christ was not crucified and he didn't rise from the dead. Do you understand the argument?
I understand the argument. What's the other one? What was the other one?
So we've talked about the veneration of a Sunday. The second one is that the very first Christians all proclaimed that they had literally seen Christ rise from the dead. There is no reason for them to do so if the Quran is true.
No, I'm not talking about Quran. Let's look at the Quran. Like, for example, like, what is the basis of that? You said again, is that based on the New Testament?
Okay,
evidence?
right.
Based
So,
on Josephus?
right. So it's not based on the New Testament evidence. Remember,
Yeah. Or is it based?
Christians don't believe in the resurrection because of the New Testament. They write the New Testament because of the resurrection.
Because of that.
Because of the resurrection.
What you said is that, for example, them believing that
Yes.
they saw, that's a historical fact.
That is a historical fact, yes.
So then, what would be the historical evidence for
Right,
that
so
fact?
the historical evidence is this.
Yeah.
The fact that the church proclaimed the resurrection, which is in an indisputable historical fact, the fact that the church did that,
Yeah.
right, and then went on to write about it in their Gospels and write about it in their letters of Paul, demonstrates that that is a belief that predates the New Testament. It predates Paul.
So what the historical fact is that they believe they saw
The resurrection, and they went on to teach it.
Okay.
So, no, the thing is, you don't just have to take my word for it. Even scholars that doubt the resurrection do not doubt that the first apostles had an experience that was transformative.
What the historians would say, I think, is they would say that there were people
Yeah.
that believed that.
Yes.
So that would be the historical fact. you
Great.
said.
That is exactly what I'm saying. Right? So my point
And
is,
that belief is recorded where?
in the Gospels and in the writings of Paul,
Oh, there you go.
and then in the writings of the Church Fathers. So my point to you is, and this is so my point to you is, the question that you have to answer is, given the fact that they did believe that, the question is, why? Now, the problem for you as a Muslim is this: if the Quran is true, then there was no reason for them to believe that at all, because Jesus was never crucified, and therefore he could never have risen from the dead.
I don't know much about the Quranic
That's fine.
fiction, but
That's fine.
I just wanted to know what is it based on. Because
Yeah.
what would you say, for example, is there like evidence within the text? Because I'm sure like the Muslims, they will say to you that all the Gospels are unreliable.
Yeah.
So would there be something that would like override that, for example? Like
Yes.
you say this particular aspect is
Yes.
this. Okay, you can dispute
Yes.
all of it, but this particular aspect is solid.
The reason why Muslims say that you don't need to believe the Gospels aren't true, is because they don't get history. And they don't deal with this historical fact. The historical fact is, Christians didn't believe in the resurrection because someone wrote the Gospels. They wrote the Gospels because they believed in the resurrection. So when a Muslim says, when a Muslim says, well, we can't trust the Gospels, the reality is that's actually irrelevant to the question of the resurrection. The belief in the resurrection predates the Gospels.
I understand.
And I'll give you an example to that, to prove that, to demonstrate that. Paul writes his letters to churches. And one of the churches that he wrote to was the church in Rome. This church was not founded by Paul. So he wrote to Christians that he did not start about beliefs that they had, which means that they had that belief before he wrote the letter to them, and that demonstrates that the belief predates the letter.
Okay, and did they share the same beliefs as him?
About the resurrection, yes.
All right.
So there's your evidence.
That's fine. Okay. Just what did you say the other one was? You said there's 12, right? for
There's
example?
12, yeah. So another...
All of them kind of like linked to some background
Event. They are.
They're all kind of based on like, oh, this is what Jews would believe. First Christian Jews would believe, and it's
Yeah.
contrary to them.
Yes.
And therefore that gives more credence to the idea that this happened.
Absolutely.
That's the style of the argument.
It's called paradigmatic models. So let me explain what a paradigmatic model is. If someone came to you as a Muslim, a believing Muslim, and said, I've got evidence that the Quran has been changed, what is your instinctive reaction to that statement?
Just prove it. It's not true.
It's not true. That's because you have a paradigmatic model about what is true. Let me give you another example. If someone walked up to you and said, white people are superior to black people, what would you say to that statement?
It's not true.
It's not true, because you have a paradigmatic model that states that's not true. Let's imagine you were in a field or in the desert somewhere.
I get it. You're saying that the early Christian
have-
Jews believed in a certain thing. They had a certain
Way of thinking.
way of thinking
Yes.
that was then broken. Or
Bingo.
That was then broken by this.
Yes.
So
So my point to you is, the paradigmatic model of first century Jews in Second Temple Judaism did not allow for the idea of an individual resurrection prior to the general resurrection. Nobody believed that. It was impossible. It's like someone coming to you and saying, the Quran's been changed. It's impossible in your worldview. But these first Jews did come to believe that. And so the question is, why?
And so you're saying the most plausible reason is that the resurrection did happen,
Absolutely.
and you
That
have
is the answer. Now, the thing is, when you've got these historical facts, Christians can give one answer that explains all the facts all at once, without stretching the evidence, without reinterpreting the evidence, without ignoring the evidence. Muslims, according to the Quranic narrative, can only account for 3 of those facts. That Christ was crucified because someone looked like Jesus.
Okay.
That Christ died and was buried because someone looked like Jesus.
Okay.
Right? And that the apostles were distraught that their teacher had died. The Quranic narrative can explain those 3 facts, because someone like Jesus was crucified. And everybody believed that that was Jesus. But they can't explain the rest.
Can't explain Sunday.
They can't explain the Sunday. They can't explain the empty tomb. They can't explain the centrality of the resurrection to the message of the church. They can't explain the fact that this message was the birth of the church. They can't explain the fact that Jesus's resurrection was proclaimed in the same city that everybody knew he died in.
In the same city? Okay.
Jerusalem.
Okay.
Yeah, the resurrection was proclaimed in a city where people had witnessed the crucifixion. Right? But yet the people, and they can't explain the fact of the veneration of the Sunday. They can't explain the fact that James, who was a skeptic about Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus, became a founding father of the church. James, the brother of Jesus. He became the leader of the church in Jerusalem after Peter went off to do missionary work. And they can't explain that Paul, who was a persecutor of the church, became a Christian. All of those events can be explained if you believe in the resurrection. None of them can be explained if you don't believe that Jesus was resurrected. But they did happen.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was trying to get back to. Like, what would all of those facts I wanted to ask you were, what is it all based on?
Yeah.
And so, I get it now.
Yeah.
Because you said 12 indisputable facts, and a lot of them are based on the Jewish background.
Yes, very much so. That's actually really key to the entire argument. Is that my argument makes more sense when you understand first century Judaism.
So what do you say to those Muslims that say, I don't believe it, all your sources are corrupt anyway?
Right.
That would